Paul. Thank you all very much. It's a lovely day. You should be outside. I apologize to the specialist among you. You won't learn anything new. Maybe I'll be able to crack a joke or two you haven't heard. That's not a guarantee. I am not going to talk about the Middle East solely. I will speak about the world of Islam. It is an introductory lecture. I'd like you to appreciate and perhaps even encourage you to read more about Islam, because the truth shall set you free. And it will also relax you. You'll see it is a civilization. Islam. Let me click. This is the Middle East on the eve of the birth of a new religion, Islam. The Middle East consisted at that point of the Roman Empire, of what was left of it, mostly in the east. The Greek Eastern Roman Orthodox Empire, which a late Renaissance German scholar sometime in the early 16th century called the Byzantine Empire. And almost everybody has misnamed it that. The Greeks never called themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans. And the Arabs called them Rum, which means Roman. So just keep that in mind. This was Christianity. By no means was it uniform. The three main strains were the Chalcedonian, the Monophysite, and the Nestorian rites. With the dominant Chalcedonian rite didn't like the Monophysites or the Nestorians, so they tended to suppress one another, whoever had the upper hand. At one point the Nestorians mostly moved to the Fertile Crescent, and they preferred the rule of the Sasanians or the Persians. The Sasanians, ladies and gentlemen, were Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism is basically a religion of fire worship, and it condoned, among other things, incest. I think they must have picked it up from the Egyptians, but it was part of the liturgy. So other people, especially Christians, found that mildly amusing and opposed Zoroastrianism and its spread. I stress Zoroastrianism also because the Aryan Plains, what was the Persian Empire, under the Sasanians, saw the rise of antinomian sects which eventually metastasized and impacted Judaism and Christianity. Antinomian sects means people who thought all matter was evil. And eventually that turned into hostility towards private property. One of the Zoroastrian sects resolved that, for example, the potentates, rich people, had pretty wives, so we should collectivize women. If that sounds like Bolshevism, you're absolutely right. It was a heresy 2,500 years ago. It's nothing new under the sun. And I'm sorry to say that little nook and cranny of the world was the first, or at least first that we can find any written record of, to toy with extremism. And it all boils down to antinomianism, hatred of things material. Antinomians hated matter to that scale that later they would preach non-propagation. Since all matter was evil, humanity should die out, and maybe something new would be born. If it sounds modern, you bet. About 2,500 years ago, those sentiments circulated already. This is the context, and I would be amiss if I didn't add Judaism. Judaism at that point was still pre-Talmudic, but it reached in every corner of the known universe because of the Roman Empire all the way to the west, and because of the Sassanid empires, and because of what you all, or most of you, have read in the Bible, of the dispersal of the Jewish people. There were even Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, living in a town you now know as Medina, but also in the neighborhood there, everywhere. And then they were pagans. Pagans of a variety of animistic persuasions. Theirs was a polytheistic world. In Mecca, in what is now the Grand Mosque, there was a shrine to as many gods as there were days in the year. There was, however, in Arabia, a trend to recognize a supreme deity, God, Allah. This was before Islam even. And as you will see, Islam had a moderating influence on animistic pagan cults. What do I mean? Well, I'll just give you one example, because we'll never leave here if I were to continue in my usual vein. You'd be my captive audience. In pre-Islamic times, it was quite routine in Arabia to bury infant girls alive in the sand. Why? A girl? I was waiting for a son. The Quran explicitly forbids that, because it was a widespread practice. Savagery applied on the outskirts of civilization, because that's what Arabia was. There were some Arab tribes which were Christian, by the way, but most of them practiced paganism with a variety of unbecoming rituals. Also, please remember that the Ethiopian kingdom was already Christian. This is the third eldest Christian kingdom in the world, after Armenia and Georgia. So, to the southwest, the nomads, the Bedouins, and the Arabs also interacted with a form of Christianity, monotheism. When you look at the Fertile Crescent, and even its fringe, Arabian fringe, you will immediately remember the Riverine empires, and that's the broader context. That is where the city was born, in Mesopotamia, with its various arrangements. Sure, Mecca and Medina were pale expressions of that once robust civilization, but for the most part, it was pretty good. Why? Because Riverine civilizations tended to be rather tyrannical, for the most part. Why? If you relied on two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, you had to make sure that the waterworks were in top shape. Who likes to dig around in mud? Any volunteers? Well, then if I'm the king Sargon, I'll make you dig. Hence a tyrannical society. To maintain the system of channels and irrigation, a tyranny arose. With the Arabs in Mecca and Medina, long time after the Riverine civilizations were no more, there was a residual spirit of this, but for the most part, their society was based on family and clan. They identified by clan. And that's something that Islam moderated too, namely Muhammad, the prophet of the Muslims, argued that there is a universal community and one should not identify with the clan, but one should submit to Allah. Why was that an improvement? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if I come from one clan and Paul comes from another and I slug him, then his kinsmen go after my kinsmen. God forbid I kill him. Then they kill one another for an indefinite period of time, and 700 years later, They still don't remember why. Blood feud. The Quran was the strongest attempt to mollify this. Various other practices too, which are castigated by the Quran, originate in tribal ways. That includes, for instance, homosexuality or bestiality. If there is no God, as you know, everything goes. And everything is equal. And everything is awesome. And equally awesome. When there is God, and you fear him, or you listen to what Christians call natural law, with the Muslims it's a different expression, then we adjust our behavior accordingly. You know, Christianity, as you know, is the most unnatural religion because I may only have one wife. I don't get to party. That sucks. Yes, just ponder this if you can for a second. And back to Islam. Muhammad is the prophet. He heard voices. Just so everybody would know, his mother also heard voices, and that's hereditary. And he struggled against that. He would go out of Mecca into the cave and meditate. And he had visions. And then he would recite those visions for a long time. What he experienced, he recited. It sort of meshed with his observations acquired during travels. And he did travel in caravans all the way up to what is now Syria. He acquired some knowledge of Christianity and much more of Judaism. To a large extent, Islam is a Jewish sect, as far as many of its structures, including the ulama, which is the rabbinate. Of course, Islam grew and morphed incrementally. It took a time to form in the way we know it now, but it borrowed heavily from the neighbors, and it also created a world of its own, with Muhammad as the prophet, Quran as the holy book, and the hadith, or ahadith, that is the sayings of the prophet, some of them verified, others less so, and still others recognized by the Muslims as completely apocryphal, but sometimes funny, so they still can bring them up for, I don't know, intellectual value and anecdotal value. When Muhammad first started out, his following consisted of his wife, then of some members of his closest family and friends. They were the closest companions who left Mecca for Medina. That escaped marks the beginning of the Muslim age, year zero, if you will. And eventually he was able to triumph over his detractors, some of whom were his family, some of whom considered him a renegade from the clan. Kuirash, I think the clan was called. When Muhammad died, in every situation like this, the most burning issue is succession. There were three ideas. One was an oligarchy. So the closest companions would discuss, intrigue, and agree upon a candidate who would then be shown to the followers, and the followers would vote by, not vote, but acknowledge the succession by acclamation. Second idea in early Islam was a dynasty. And the third idea was none of the above. Instead, purity, ethics. We don't care who the caliph is. Khalifa, the successor to Muhammad. We care only that the person is decent and keeps strictly to how Muhammad would run things had he still been alive. There were three groups from the very beginning. Sometimes people say no, just two groups: the oligarchs and the partisans of dynasty. So the first group, oligarchy group, claimed that they were the true depository of the Sunnah, and the Caliphate, the successor to Muhammad, was uniquely qualified to keep the Sunnah, the norms. If we repeat everything faithfully, the norms are going to be a guarantee of us keeping faith with Muhammad and Allah. The norms. It's called Sunnah, hence Sunni Muslims. The partisans of a monarchy, dynasty, wanted Ali, a close relative of Muhammad, to succeed because he was the purist. They call themselves the partisans, or Shia. The third group thought Ali was the purist, therefore we should support the purist, but not because he was so closely related to the Muhammad. And they call themselves the Asharites. That combination still applies. Sunni, Shia, and the purists. I will tell you just a little bit about the Sunni, Shia, and the purists. Just a little bit, because we have no time. There was immediately competition for the interpretation of the heritage of Islam. So 4 schools were left standing after about 300 years. The most extreme of it is Hanbali. We have Maliki and 2 others. However, there was a very interesting school which was influenced by Greek rationalism. Those are the Mu'attalites. They brought logos into Islam. They were Islam's great hope. Unfortunately, they were suppressed by the competition. And even though they persecuted Al-Hanbali, or they had the Caliph persecute the most extreme of the school of leaders of the schools, they ultimately were defeated. When they were defeated, they were persecuted. Some were killed. Their works were burned. Everything was lost irreparably until a secular archaeological Egyptian expedition showed up in Yemen and unearthed in an hermitage way in the sands of Yemen, a whole treasure trove of the Mu'attali thought, and I'm not going to talk about it because there's someone else who is much more qualified. But I will give you a zinger. The door, it was pronounced by all surviving victorious schools of Islamic jurisprudence or theological jurisprudence, that the door to its jihad closed about 300 years after the death of Muhammad. That means no innovation and experimentation was permitted. It was haram. Not to the Mu'alakites who were in favor of exploring logos and incorporating logos into their tradition. The 4 schools, of course, had gatekeepers, the ulama, the learned, the ones who knew the Quran, the Hadith, and the ones who could pronounce some things like, can you wipe your hands after ablutions on your socks? Before you chuckle, it's exactly the same in Orthodox Judaism. Exactly the same. So, The ulama, to a large extent, mirror the development, whether or not independently from Judaism, it's another story, but of Talmudic Judaism. Not pre-Talmudic Judaism, Talmudic Judaism, which of course was born with the Baghdad Talmud around 7th century. Now, with the Shia, the partisans, all you needed to have was imam. Well, imam means a prayer leader in Islam, throughout Islam, whether it's Sunni or Shia. But the Shia elevated their imam to, well, a semi-divine status, or at least a serious messenger of God. By the way, some of the Sunni caliphs would call themselves representatives of God, not deputies of the Prophet, which didn't sit well with some of the believers, as you can imagine. And then there were Purists. The Purists were a hodgepodge of sects, cults, and Sufi. I'll tell you a couple of things about the Sufi. Since the Sunnah was considered by some stifling, the norms and ceremonies ascribed to Muhammad and repeated endlessly by the ulama were considered unfulfilling. People in Islam saw a venue. There was even a famous alim, a member of the ulama, Al-Ghazali was his name, who decided that his life sucked. As a Sunni, he could not relate to the endless repetition of the ritual. He found it empty and unfulfilling, and then he became a mendicant friar, which means a Sufi dervish. He just started wandering around, meandering. Eventually, he attempted a synthesis of Sufism with Sunnism to make Sufism kosher, non-haram. Whether or not he succeeded, that's another story, because in Islam there's no pope. Me, as an inveterate papist, can see chaos in this universe, ladies and gentlemen, but it works in Islam. It's very heterodox. There is not just one dude. Islam is very heterodox. So I'll tell you something about purist cults. I've mentioned the Ash'arites. I will not go on throughout the history of Islam, which is very interesting as far as the cults and sects are concerned. But the Ash'arites decided, even though they backed Ali, that Ali was a wimp. He defeated the Umayyads. There was immediately a civil war in the wake of, almost immediately, of the death of Muhammad, because the people who seized power had been detractors of Muhammad, and they hated him and they fought him. However, because they were the oligarchs of Mecca, they had the money, they had the means, they had the resources, and once Islam spread, they created a base in Damascus, and from there, after the last of the rightly guided caliphs died, they set up a dynasty for themselves. Well, Ali fought them with the help of not only the partisans, Shia, but also with the help of a sect of the Purists, the Ash'arites. And he won. However, Ali was a kind guy. He was a really, really kind person. So he compromised. The Ash'arites, the Purists, said, "What? That's unacceptable," and they killed him. They assassinated him. And then the Ash'arites spawned various other Purist movements, each time stressing, all we have to do is have a Mahdi, a clone of the Prophet this time, who will lead us, and we have to restore the situation how it was during Muhammad's time and do exactly what he said. All the accretions, especially logos, all the accretions have to be exterminated. only a pure interpretation of the Quran, the life of Muhammad. No imitatio Christi, imitatio Muhammad. And the Hadith. That's all we need. And the sects tended to be rather extreme, and the sects tended to, some of them tended to be very successful. I'll tell you about a few. An offshoot of the Ash'arites was the Qaramations. They set up their base in Yemen. Ladies and gentlemen, they took to raiding caravans to Mecca, meaning pilgrims, and then they would ask them questions, theological questions about the Quran and the Hadith. If the answer was, in the view of the Qaramations, inappropriate, they'd kill them. They also raided Mecca itself and stole the black stone, because they said only they were true Muslims. Does it sound familiar? Now we're talking 1400 years ago. Sects. They're still Muslim, but please do not mistake ISIS for mainstream Sunni any more than you would mistake David Koresh or, remember Jones in Guyana? Yeah? For mainstream Christianity. The problem is there's no Pope in Islam. So nobody can say what goes and what doesn't go. And here is a visit into the late 20th century, our lawyers, government lawyers, Department of Justice lawyers, no offense to anybody in this room that's connected to them, were striving very hard to find the blind sheik who was behind the attacks on the World Trade Center, un-Islamic. Except everything in his writings, in his sermons, was kosher. All the quotes were perfectly harmonized with the teachings of Islam. He was a Muslim, and he was a righteous Muslim, except he was from a sect. He was like the Ash'arites of the old. So if you look at Al-Qaeda, and you have a politician stand up and tell you, oh, they're not Muslims, or ISIS, well, they're not Muslims. Well, that means the politician is so open-minded that his brain fell out. That's what it means. And it doesn't reflect badly on Christianity when we talk about Jim Jones in Guyana. I was acculturated in the Bay Area. Some people said they were not Christians. Well, they were a sect. What's the big deal? It's not offensive to Islam to say the same thing. ISIS, it's a sect. They think they are justified by God. And they can quote the Quran to that effect, just like Jim Jones, just like David Koresh and everybody else. That's as simple as that. So let's not be in denial. And the roots of it are at the origin of Islam. At the origin. Okay. What way did Islam spread? Two main ways. First one was through jihad, holy war. Ghazi, holy warriors, attacked, took booty, they felt blessed, they won, which means Allah justified what they were doing. But the second,
next slide.
Yeah, the second, that's right. The second most effective way was through trade and missionary activities. And that is oftentimes overlooked. And that is the way that Islam reached both East and West Africa, and eventually this is jihad mostly. But here you have what I wanted to show you. Most of this was through trade and missionary activities. Well, when Islam spread through jihad, the winners got to call the shots, and they suppressed everything they met. When Islam spread through trade and missionary activity, it had to compromise So in many places, whether Central Asia, Southeast Asia, India, to an extent, and West Africa, it had to survive with local arrangements. In some places where local elites embraced Islam over time, they kept most of their ways. So if you go to Indonesia or Mindanao or somewhere, you will recognize immediately what is Islamic and what is local, especially if you know the cultures of the Middle East. They're not Arabs. They're their own people. So don't only think about jihad. Also, jihad has several connotations. First of all, you have to struggle within to be a true Muslim. That's jihad too. Then there is the outside struggle, and the outside struggle is divided into missionary activity and warlike activity. That is, you go and preach, proselytize. That's also jihad. And then there is war. No, Islam is not a religion of peace. The closest it comes to Christianity, in Christianity is when, I think in Matthew there is a passage about bringing the sword. That's a little one. The Quran is peppered with references to jihad. And I challenge anybody to show me a single medieval Islamic source, say from Spain, Al-Andalus, that refers to jihad as the inner spiritual struggle. It just says, go and kill them. And you have an obligation to do so once a year. That's the Maliki school, by the way. Not a single reference to missionary or any other activity but war. That's medieval Islam. In the Balkans, same story, a little bit later, so late medieval times and early Renaissance times by Christian reckoning. Same story in the Balkans. Not so much, as I said, in Malaysia. There the local elites embraced Islam, and when there was jihad waged, and there was, it was the continuation of the old wars between various states, as opposed to a master plan to take over the world that emanated from Arabia.
The next slide has Malaysia and up to the 1500s. There we go.
I duly oblige. This is the Islamic world. Only once in a blue moon in those days would a Muslim from Malaysia, Zanzibar, especially the far-flung places, West Africa, go to Mecca. It was very impossible to go on a pilgrimage. And that's, as you know, one of the 5 pillars of faith. However, there were teachers. And most, or at least a plurality of them, tended to be Sunni. Why? Well, imagine if an Asharite purist showed up in West Africa, he'd be eaten for breakfast, literally speaking. But if the Sunnis showed up, the locals considered them, oh, holy fools. And if they were decent and nice, then the locals would bring them presents and get used to them. So the Sufi effort to spread the faith in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, have been incredible. But they came first. Nothing orthodox, just the Kumbaya crowd. Well, just before you think that Sufism overall is Kumbaya, Sufism also was behind the spread of the Ottoman Empire. The Sufi fraternities, which by day would, I don't know, worship a saint, serve as a hostel for people who wanted to pray and perfect their Islam, or learn how to weave, would don their armor and go on a jihad and conquer for the Ottoman Empire, kill everybody for Allah, until they submitted. So please don't try to think in a compartmentalized form where where Sufi are good, that's the State Department thinking, and Sunni are maybe all right, the Shia are bad unless they are with the Shah. No, none of this. Every case must be considered separately. I'm just saying because the Sufi were the least orthodox of all Muslims, they sat well on Mindanao or in what is now Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast in West Africa. They were not seen as threatening to the local customs, and indeed they absorbed local customs to the effect where when Arab or even Turkic visitors showed up around this time and later, they were shocked to see what form of Islam there obtained in certain far-flung ports. I did mention that Islam was a moderating influence as it issued from the Bedouin milieu. The girls buried alive, that's what I'm referring to. Ladies and gentlemen, it was also the case in other places. For instance, in Africa, those missionaries tried to moderate some of the savage customs, including cannibalism, sometimes to their own detriment. Well, I'll tell you one anecdote from Indonesia. It was customary after a woman gave birth in those shamanistic societies to burn off the impurity by roasting her, so placing her over fire or near fire. Talking about postpartum mom. I mean, Islam didn't take care of it immediately, but it moderated it greatly. So let's put her somewhere around the fire, not necessarily over fire, because it gives her blisters, and it must not be a pleasant, well, we have to cast the demons out, that's our way. And the Sufis wouldn't insist, but they sort of moderated things. Well, those practices didn't end until Islam was interrupted in its ways. Christianity. The Christians were not shy. When they didn't like something, they said so. When the Spaniards witnessed the Aztecs ripping out their hearts and devouring them, and flaying the sacrificial victims alive and donning their skins, and since the god worshipped in what is now Mexico City was a serpent, they thought it was Satan. So they gave everybody a treatment. Just killed them. There was no more human sacrifice. I wouldn't say there was liberation, it was a great improvement because the Spaniards enslaved everybody, as opposed to sacrificing everybody, as was the case in the pre-Christian time. In India, the British, when they conquered, this is what interrupted the rise of Islam. The voyages of discovery, exploration, God, glory, gold. The Christians were driven. It should have been the Chinese, but the Chinese thought the world sucked. And the world had nothing to offer, everybody was an idiot and a barbarian. So they made it all the way to Brazil. We have DNA evidence, their great fleet sailed to Australia, Africa, and they said, eh. So there was no more China. Anyway, outside of China. Colonial empires. Generally speaking, the colonials did not interfere with Islam. In fact, in British West Africa and French West Africa, Christian missionaries were barred from Muslim areas. They were allowed to proselytize among the animists, but not among the natives. Their government forbade that because they thought Islam was a civilization, an advanced civilization. It was a great, vast improvement over savagery. So they basically tried to co-opt local elites, the ulema, in case of Senegal, marabouts they were called, to form some kind of a mediating institution between the local Muslims and the colonial powers. Elsewhere, they did so in India, which is now, including the part that is now Pakistan. In India, they left the Muslims alone pretty much, and they even favored the Muslims. They had beef with the Hindus from the point of view of religion, much more than with the Muslims. Now, it doesn't mean that the British didn't subjugate the Muslims. I'm talking about the British Raj. They were not bothered by the Muslim religion. They didn't love it, they sneered at it oftentimes, but they left it pretty much alone. Not so much with the Hindus. There were two facets of, again, multifarious Hindu faiths that bothered the British. One was the cult of Kali, the goddess of death, and the Muslims approved the British suppression of the particular cult because they had tried vainly for several hundreds of years to get rid of it. All of you, I'm sure, know the English word thug. That comes from the Thagis, who were the worshippers of Kali. They would dress up as peasants or travelers and set up on caravans, have an orgy of killing and everything else you can imagine to sacrifice to the goddess Kali. Since for the British that interfered with trade and Adam Smith, the British suppressed it forcefully. They just killed active worshippers of Kali who attacked caravans. Second problem that the British had was not Islamic either. It was strictly Hindu, namely the practice of sati. When a man died, his widows were incinerated. If the widows liked the family of the husband, mutually liked, they were given drugs, so they were high, as they were burned alive. If they were not burned, if they were not popular with the husband's family, they were put on the funeral pyre without any drugs. So they were burned alive and conscious. The British objected. General Sir Charles Namir was the viceroy, and the Hindus came to complain to him. They said, well, you never interfered with our ways, only the Mughals, the Muslims, didn't like our ways. You always left us alone to do just like you leave the Muslims. What's wrong with you now? It is our custom to burn women. And General Namir looked at the delegation and said, really? That may be so. It may be that your custom is to burn women. It is our custom to hang men who burn women and confiscate their property. And the practice of sati has not yet been resurrected in India because of the great Christian chauvinism. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, and the Dutch didn't like the women being roasted over fire in Indonesia either, to purify them. And they were very opinionated and not shy about their Christianity, that we are all children of God and each soul has dignity. So we acted on the Dutch, acted accordingly in Indonesia. They interfered. Call it cultural imperialism in favor of women. I wonder what the feminists will have to say about that. Okay. Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is a civilization. It's not a race. Anyone of you who has ever met Falashe, or even the Hui people in China, know that Jews come in all shapes and forms. There are Sephardi Jews. My cousin's wife, Nadia, is a Sephardi. There are Ashkenazic Jews. My aunt's family, husband's family in Denmark, they're all blondes with blue eyes. It's not a race. Same with the Muslims. You go to Bosnia, you even look at some Berbers with blue eyes. That's because of Al-Andalus. It's a civilization. It's the way you choose to be civilized. I know it doesn't sit well with the original heart of Islam, that is the Arab people, especially from what is now Saudi Arabia, but it is a civilization. You go to Malaysia, it's a civilization. They all look differently, just like with Christianity. Christianity, ladies and gentlemen, Pace Louis Farrakhan, is not a religion of white people. It's a civilization. It's a religion of everyone. With Islam, you see, it's greatly diffused throughout the world.
Next slide.
Yeah, the next slide.
No, one
No?
after that.
Okay.
One more.
One.
There we go.
Okay. This is also, this doesn't give it justice. Let me go to content. You see, well, just
If you just want a
admire-
plain old global map, the next one after this.
No, this is fine. Well,
Okay.
I want everybody to appreciate this, but I'll give you a plain global map. Oh, I won't.
Double click on that.
Okay. Can we make it bigger?
I don't know. There we go.
What the map doesn't show you, usually maps don't show you this, there are Muslims in Latin America. There have been Muslim missionaries, usually from Saudi Arabia, trying hard to convince Guatemalan Indians that they are really Moranos, that is the descendants of Moors of Spain, with some success, financial success. If you look at La Triple Frontera, a very interesting spot from the point of view of our intelligence community. This is the, how should I put it, pirate capital of the world. Piracy, I can get you a Hollywood movie before it comes out. In Hollywood, anything. This is a La Triple Frontera on the inside of Paraguay, but on the border with Brazil. In Uruguay, this is the hub of the Middle East. There are lots of Middle Eastern emigres and increasingly now Muslims there. So there is an ongoing diffusion of Islam. Why? Because unlike Christians who are embarrassed and tepid in their faith, the Muslims care. The Muslims care. So Islam is everywhere. For better or worse, it's just a civilization and religion that is alive. Why would you expect anything to freeze or die? It simply doesn't happen. La Triple Frontera has been for over 100 years a favorite destination for poor people from Lebanon. Most of them who came initially were Christians. They're Arabs, they're Christians from Mount Lebanon. But now it's the poorest people. Who's the poorest in Lebanon? The Shia. So Hezbollah is able to get to illegally tax the immigrants to the tune of $100 million in that little tiny spot, if you're wondering. That's the last map. But, what are the current issues? Well, the issues have been the same since the Safavid Empire noticed that it was not as advanced as the Ottoman Empire, which still had the mojo. So they wanted to reform the Safavids. And they invited European experts, mostly military experts. Reform, modernize, and secularize. Well, as far as secularization, not only the Middle East, but the Arab world tends to follow the Ataturkic phenomenon with many modifications. Nasser in Egypt kept a lot of Islam in his program. He paid lip service to it. Ataturk was extremely hostile to Islam, so he got rid of as much as he could. And it turns out that, again, Islam doesn't die. Has anybody been to Turkey recently? Okay. Have you noticed little minarets and prayer spaces attached to gas stations. That's a new development. That's Erdogan. That's Erdogan. Atatürk is spinning in his grave. You cannot exterminate a civilization unless you kill everybody. He thought he would terrorize everybody and the Turks would forget in 2 or 3 generations. Nasser didn't have that sort of a hope. He just thought he would have enough of an enlightened elite. And what is the face of modernization? Well, the least virulent was that of the Shah of Iran, who was basically agnostic. He was even thinking about bringing back Zoroastrianism. But there were Shahs like this in Iran, and even in Afghanistan, where at the beginning of the 20th century, women walked around Kabul unveiled. So there were attempts to secularize before. It's best not to be rabid. It is best to be moderate in modernization. In Afghanistan, when the king sent out in the middle of the 20th century teachers, secular teachers, there was not much resistance in the villages, some grumbling, but that was okay. Once the communists attempted to use the secular teachers as the conveyor belts of their propaganda, all the teachers were killed. And it's gotten worse. Afghanistan went back to, 15th century because of a harebrained attempt to modernize in a way that was not congruent with the people. Their ways, the royal way, was the correct one. Easy does it. There were women at universities. Also, please remember that if you look at pictures, say, of Egypt with its secularization, in the 1970s, the graduating class would have lots of unveiled women, very few with a scarf. And then the scarves reappear, even under Sadat and Mubarak. This was not due to the terror of the Islamists. It was also a fact that very many provincial countryside women came to attend universities, and some of them felt comfortable because that was a piece of their world which they had left behind, very conservative. And then you had mingling of secularists. Now, if you look at pictures in Egypt, scarves or Islamic gear are de rigueur. I have to tell you that I insinuated myself into a swimming pool when I was checking on the Syrian border, where women had surfing suits and a scarf in Turkey. Yeah. But I was still allowed there. Nobody told me. I didn't do it on purpose. I just wanted to go swimming. That's all. But I would not panic over this. What I would really get upset, and the king of Afghanistan did get upset about, was when the competition between 2 communist parties of Afghanistan, the Maoist and the Stalinist, became so fierce that it bred defectors who decided that the best expression of fanaticism would be Muslim fundamentalism or sect. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who started out with the Maoists, graduated to throwing acid into women's faces at the University of Kabul. And he was a mujahideen fighting the jihad against the Soviets. And now he tries to reinvent himself because he's been overshadowed by the Taliban. In any event, in Islam, for over 1,000 years, we have a reoccurrent pattern where a group of reformers arises who strive for purity. They think that a conspiratorial organization that's well motivated can attract mass following, overthrow a tyrant. And make no mistake, throughout history, most of their victims were Muslims. Muslims. They would go after everybody else next, but they turned on fellow Muslims who were insufficiently hardcore for them. And that is what is happening with ISIS. Everybody talks about the Yazidi or a handful of Christians who perish at the hands of ISIS, but most victims are Muslims. So it is in the interest of local Muslims to take care of ISIS and give them the treatment. We just haven't found a formula. We don't know whom to help, how to help, etc. But again, this has been a recurring phenomenon. Please remember that the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown by a conspiratorial organization started out by one sectarian guy who was able to attract maybe 2,000-3,000 followers. And he brought the Abbasids to power with his people. Then the Abbasids invited him to a party and killed him. That was their gratitude. Why? Because he was one of the sectarians, one of the Purists, one of the cults, a David Koresh. Except with Christian sects, they tend to be autonomous. They would like to stay in their own universe and not be left unbothered. With Islam, you have the obligation to do jihad. And the ISIS interpretation of jihad is kill everyone who doesn't submit, enslave everybody, to be a complete contradiction of what the West is. And I'm not talking about San Francisco. They speak openly. Who stopped slavery? Christian missionaries, the colonialists. We must crush them. And we must restore slavery and everything else. So Islam would be pure again.